The valley went quiet in a way that meant something was about to happen. Corporal Reyes felt it first, the way a man who has been shot at enough times develops a second skin for pressure changes in the air. He didn't say anything. He didn't have time. The first round took Staff Sergeant Doyle through the meat of his left shoulder and spun him half around before the ground caught him. And by the time the echo of that single shot rolled back off the canyon walls, 3 more had already followed it, and 2 more men were down. And the patrol that had walked into the mouth of Amber Hollow 11 minutes earlier now had exactly 90 seconds to become something other than dead. This is the part of the story that gets told at reunions and retirement dinners, usually with the details sanded down into something cleaner than what actually happened. What actually happened was this: 40 meters up a scree slope littered with juniper scrub, a woman who was not supposed to be within a mile of the front of that patrol picked up a rifle that belonged to a man who was currently being kept alive by a tourniquet and a medic's flat, professional calm, and she did the math. Nobody had trained her to do the math under those particular conditions. That was the thing that would follow her for the rest of her career, whispered in briefing rooms, with a kind of reverence that always made her uncomfortable. Nobody had trained her. She had simply spent 2 years training herself in the gaps between her actual job, because the actual job, counting things, tracking things, making sure the right crates went to the right places, had never been enough to hold the whole of her attention. Margaret Ashford went by Maggie, and almost nobody used her rank when they wanted something from her, because almost nobody remembered that specialist was a rank, and not just a word that meant the one who fixes the paperwork. She was 27 years old. She had been assigned to Forward Operating Base Amber Hollow for 14 months as a Supply and Logistics NCO, which meant that on any given day she knew, with an accuracy that bordered on the unsettling, exactly how many rounds of 7.62 sat in the ammunition cache, exactly how many pairs of boots had been issued to which units, exactly how far the base's water reserves would stretch if the resupply convoy was delayed by a storm. She had a system for the way she stacked crates, heaviest on bottom, lightest on top, labels facing outward, so she never had to turn a box to read it twice. She had a system for the 15 minutes before dawn when she ran the perimeter road alone, because the cold made her mind quiet in a way that nothing else did. She had a system, even, for grief, learned the hard way 3 years earlier when her older brother's National Guard unit lost a soldier in a training accident back in Ohio, and she had discovered that if she didn't build a container for a feeling, the feeling built its own container out of whatever was closest: her sleep, her appetite, the small kindnesses she owed the people around her. Numbers didn't do that to her. Numbers held still. It was Gunnery Sergeant Prescott who noticed her doing math nobody had asked her to do. He found her one evening in October, sitting outside the supply tent with a legal pad working out. For no reason she could have explained to anyone who asked, and several people did ask, the drop of a .308 round at 600 yards in 20-degree crosswind. Cross-checking her numbers against a ballistics chart she'd printed off a range manual and folded into quarters so many times the creases had gone soft and gray. Prescott was 51 years old, built like a fence post, and had spent 11 of his 26 years in the Corps as a scout sniper instructor before a knee injury moved him into a training billet that everyone privately understood was a kindness the Corps rarely extended, and that Prescott would rather have died than admit he was grateful for. He looked at her numbers for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Where'd you learn to calculate spin drift?" "I didn't," Ashford said. "I'm guessing you're not guessing." He crouched down, uninvited, and tapped a line on her legal pad with one blunt finger. "That's the Coriolis correction. Most range-qualified shooters in this brigade couldn't tell you Coriolis matters past 800 meters, let alone why." "Where'd you learn it?" The honest answer was a public library in Billings, Montana, 3 summers before she enlisted, when she was 22 years old and working the overnight shift at a grain elevator and reading everything she could get her hands on, because her father had been a wildcat well surveyor who did trajectory math for a living: pressure, angle, distance, the physics of things moving through resistant air, and some of that had gotten into her the way things get into children who watched parents work with total absorption. It wasn't marksmanship. Her father had never held a rifle in his life that she knew of, but it was the same shape of thinking, and when she'd stumbled onto an old Marine Corps sniper training manual in a used bookstore, something in her had recognized the math before she'd recognized the purpose it served. Books, she said, and I like knowing why numbers work, not just that they work. Prescott didn't say anything else that night. But 2 weeks later, he started finding reasons to walk past the supply tent around dusk. And somewhere in the third or fourth of those visits, without either of them ever formally agreeing to it, it became a kind of unofficial apprenticeship. He would give her a scenario, 600 yards, headwind, target moving obliquely across her position at a slow walk, and she would work it on paper, and he would tell her where she was right and where the desert would eat her calculations alive if she wasn't careful, because paper didn't account for mirage, for the way heat-off sun-baked rock could bend a sightline enough to miss a man entirely at distance. "You're not going to be a shooter," he told her once, not unkindly. "That's not what this is. But a mind that thinks this way is wasted counting boot sizes, and I don't like waste." She had laughed at the time. She did not, in October, believe that the math would ever leave the legal pad. The patrol that walked into Amber Hollow's western approach on a gray Tuesday morning in March was not supposed to need a shooter who thought in Coriolis corrections. It was a coordination run. 9 men delivering intelligence gear to a partnered outpost 11 kilometers out, routine enough that Ashford had only come along because the convoy needed an extra body to manage a supply handoff, and because Captain Bishop, who ran logistics for the base and trusted her judgment more than her rank technically earned, had asked her personally. The ambush had been staged with a patience that unsettled everyone who later reviewed the intelligence. Whoever built it had studied the patrol's movements for at least 2 weeks, had positioned 3 shooters on the high ground, with sight lines that covered every reasonable line of retreat, and had waited for a morning with enough low cloud cover to blind the drone support flying out of the main base 40 kilometers south. Doyle went down in the first 3 seconds. Corporal Reyes took a graze across the scalp that opened a wound that bled with the theatrical violence scalp wounds always do, making him look far worse than he was, though nobody had time in that first chaos to know that. Lance Corporal Fitch, 20 years old, 6 weeks from his first leave home to Tulsa, was hit center mass and did not get up, and it was his rifle, a bolt-action precision weapon he had carried as designated marksman for the patrol, now lying in the dirt beside a body that the world had not yet finished understanding was gone, that ended up in Ashford's hands roughly 40 seconds later because Corporal Yates, the patrol's medic, screamed the only sentence that made any sense in that moment. "Somebody get on that rifle. Ashford, can you shoot?" She had fired expert on her qualification range twice. She had never in her life fired at a human being, had never in her life fired anything heavier than an M4 at 400 meters, and the rifle in Fitch's dead hands was a completely different instrument, chambered for a round she'd only ever calculated on paper, zeroed to a scope she had never looked through. There is a specific kind of silence that exists inside extreme danger, one that has nothing to do with actual sound. The valley was not silent. There was gunfire. There was Yates shouting for a medevac over a radio that kept cutting in and out against the canyon walls. There was Doyle's ragged breathing as Yates worked to stop the bleeding in his shoulder. But inside Ashford's skull, something dropped into a stillness she recognized from every evening she had spent with Prescott's scenarios, and in that stillness, a decision made itself before she was fully aware of choosing it. She crawled the 11 meters to Fitch's position, took the rifle from a grip that would not easily release it, and put her eye to the scope. The first shooter was 430 meters up the northern slope, tucked into a fold of rock that would have been invisible to anyone, not specifically hunting for exactly that kind of fold. She knew it was 430 because some part of her mind that had spent months doing this work on paper was already running the numbers against the terrain in front of her, translating the abstract exercise into the concrete horror of an actual person she was about to try to kill. The wind was coming from her left at what she guessed to be 12, maybe 15 miles an hour, gusting harder in the gaps between the rock formations. At this range, the round would drop roughly 40 inches from bore line by the time it arrived, and the wind would push it another 8 to the right if she didn't correct. Elevation up the slope added a further complication that her hands understood better than her conscious mind could have articulated in the moment. The geometry of shooting uphill, the way gravity's pull on the bullet's trajectory changed with the angle, something Prescott had drilled into her using nothing more sophisticated than a diagram scratched into a paper plate. "Ashford, talk to me," Yates called, not looking up from Doyle. "I'm working," she said, and the words came out steadier than she felt, which was itself a kind of small mercy, because the steadiness in her own voice gave the rest of the patrol something to hold on to in a situation that otherwise had nothing solid in it at all. She held her correction, waited through one exhale, and on the natural pause at the bottom of her breath, the place Prescott had described 100 times as the door, not the trigger, "You're not pulling anything, you're walking through a door that's already open," she fired. 430 meters away, the first shooter stopped shooting. She did not allow herself, in that moment, to understand what that meant. Understanding would come later, in pieces, over months, in the particular quiet of nights when the valley was nowhere near her, and yet somehow always exactly as close as it had been that morning. In the moment, there was only the second shooter, repositioning 30 meters to the right of where the first had fallen, and the recalculation that repositioning demanded, and the specific, terrible discipline of doing that math again while a man screamed something in a language she didn't speak from a position she couldn't see, and Doyle's blood soaking dark into the dirt 11 meters behind her, and Yates's voice saying, "Stable. He's stable, Ashford. Sorry. Ashford. He's stable," in the scattered way people talk when their training is the only thing keeping their mouths moving in any useful direction. The second shot took longer. The angle was worse. The wind had shifted, and she lost nearly 90 seconds finding a sight line through a gap in the rock that gave her anything at all to aim at. 90 seconds in ambush is not a small unit of time. It is the distance between a patrol that survives and a patrol that does not. And she was aware of that the entire time she waited, aware of it in a way that made the waiting almost unbearable, and that she endured anyway because Prescott's voice, borrowed and internalized, was telling her that a rush shot at this range was worse than no shot at all. The second shooter fell when he leaned 6 inches too far past the edge of his cover to get a better angle on Doyle and Yates. She had been waiting for exactly that mistake, the kind of overconfidence that comes from believing your enemy is disorganized and untrained. And when it came, she was ready for it, in a way that would have astonished anyone who had known her only as the quiet woman who ran inventory counts at dawn. Captain Bishop's voice broke onto the radio from the T back at Amber Hollow, tight with an urgency he was visibly working to keep out of his tone. "Overwatch, say status. What just happened on that ridgeline?" It was Yates, astonishingly, who answered, because Ashford's hands were already moving to find the third shooter, and she did not have language to spare. "Overwatch is effective," Yates said, and something about the specific, careful neutrality of that phrase. "Not we have eyes on, not shooters down," suggested. Even Yates understood he had just described something that didn't yet have an official shape. The third shooter had gone to ground, which in Prescott's vocabulary meant patience, meant waiting for the shooter to believe enough time had passed, that movement was safe again. Ashford held her position without moving a muscle beyond the shallow mechanics of breath, for what her own internal clock told her was probably 90 seconds. Though it felt considerably longer, the cold of the ground seeping up through her jacket, a fly landing on the back of her hand and staying there because she would not permit herself the smallest motion that might cost her the shot when it came. It came at second 104, a shift in the brush 40 meters left of the second shooter's position, a shape resolving itself out of shadow into a man moving low and fast toward better cover. She did not have time for a full recalculation. She had time for instinct built on top of 6 months of paper scenarios and Prescott's voice in her memory saying, "You already know this. Stop asking your brain to check it twice. Trust the work you already did." And she fired on a lead she had judged, rather than calculated, and the third shooter went down mid-stride and did not get up. The valley did not go quiet after that. There were still two more directions the ambush had staged fighters from, still a secondary element pinned near the outpost cache entrance, still 40 minutes of coordinated chaos ahead before helicopters finally cleared the ridgeline and a medivac bird got wheels down close enough to load Doyle onto a stretcher. But the specific, immediate catastrophe, the annihilation of a 9-man patrol pinned in open ground by 3 unseen shooters, had been, in Yates's careful word, made effective. And it had been made effective by a woman whose official job that morning had been to hand off a crate of intelligence gear and go home. What the after-action reports would later call acquired precision engagement under duress took, in Ashford's memory, exactly the shape of Prescott's paperplate diagrams come alive, and she would spend a long time afterward turning that fact over, trying to decide whether it comforted her or frightened her more. It frightened her, mostly, in the ordinary daylight hours, when she was back at Amber Hollow doing inventory counts that suddenly felt like a costume she was wearing, over something that had irreversibly changed shape underneath. It comforted her at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come, and she found herself doing the math again, unprompted, running the angles and the wind speeds of that morning over and over, not because she doubted the calculations, but because doing the math was the only language she had for processing what those calculations had actually cost. Prescott came to find her 4 days after the ambush, in the same spot outside the supply tent where he'd first caught her doing unauthorized ballistics work on a legal pad. He didn't say anything about the ambush directly. He set 2 cups of coffee down, kept one, handed her the other, and sat with the specific, patient silence of a man who had spent a career learning that some conversations only work if you let the other person choose when to start them. "I keep running it," she finally said. "The numbers. Over and over. Like if I run them enough times, I'll find the version where it wasn't real." "You won't find that version," Prescott said. "There isn't one, I know. You're going to know it clearly for a long time," he said, "and you're going to carry it. That doesn't go away, and I'd be lying to you if I told you it does. But you also saved 7 lives out there, Ashford, and Doyle is going to walk his daughter down the aisle in about 6 years because of a shot you made at 430 meters with a rifle you'd never held before that morning. Both of those things are true. You don't get to pick one." She turned the coffee cup in her hands, not drinking it, watching a thin skin of steam rise and dissolve into the cold morning air. "I don't feel like someone who did something. I feel like something happened through." Prescott was quiet for a moment. "That's the only kind of person who should be doing this work," he said. "The moment it stops feeling like something moving through you and starts feeling like something you're proud of doing, that's the moment you shouldn't be trusted with a rifle anymore. What you're describing right now, the discomfort, the wanting it to not be real, that's not weakness. That's the exact thing that makes you safe to put in that position again, if it ever comes to it." It came to it again, eventually, though not in the way either of them expected. The after-action report on the Amber Hollow ambush moved up a chain of command that Ashford had never had cause to think about before, and somewhere in a building far from the valley, someone with the authority to make such decisions decided that a supply specialist who could produce that kind of result without formal sniper training was either an extraordinary anomaly or an underused resource. And the Corps, for all its faults, was generally reluctant to leave an underused resource sitting in a supply tent. The offer came 8 weeks later, delivered by Captain Bishop, with the particular carefulness of a man who understood he was handing someone a door that led to a life entirely different from the one they'd planned. Scout sniper selection, 10 weeks of training that broke roughly 60% of the candidates who started it, most of them men who had wanted to be there their entire careers and had trained specifically for the opportunity, unlike Ashford, who had backed into the possibility sideways. Through math, she'd taught herself out of boredom and grief and a stubborn refusal to let her mind sit idle. "You don't have to say yes," Bishop told her. "Nobody's going to think less of you if you stay in logistics. What you did in that valley doesn't require you to do it again." "I know," she said. She said yes anyway, and if anyone had asked her to explain precisely why, and several people did, in the weeks that followed, with varying degrees of tact, she would not have had a clean answer. It wasn't glory. She had already learned, in the specific silence of that valley, that there was no glory in it, only weight, only the particular arithmetic of lives saved, measured against something in herself that could never again claim total innocence. It was closer to a recognition that Prescott had given language to without quite meaning to. A mind built this way is wasted sitting idle, and she had spent 27 years believing that being essential and being exposed were two different categories of person, and the valley had shown her with a violence she had not asked for that they were not. Selection was, by every account she gave afterward, worse than the ambush in its own specific way. Not because it was more dangerous, but because it was longer. Because it was 100 smaller decisions instead of one enormous one. Because there was no single moment of clarity to carry her through it, only a grinding accumulation of days that asked her to prove, over and over, that the thing that had happened in Amber Hollow hadn't been an accident. There was a night in week 3. Every candidate who survived selection had a version of this night, though the details varied, when she missed a stress fire scenario so badly that the instructor, running it, a hard spare man named Chief Warrant Officer Delgado, pulled her aside afterward not to console her, but to ask her a single question. "What were you shooting at?" "The target," she said. "No," he said. "You were shooting at the clock. I watched you do it. You heard the timer, and you started rushing your fundamentals to beat it, instead of trusting your fundamentals to be fast enough on their own. Go again. Shoot the target this time, not the clock." She went again. She shot the target, not the clock. And something in that distinction, small, almost too fine to articulate, rebuilt itself inside her in a way that carried her through the remaining 7 weeks. She wrote the distinction down that night in the small green notebook she'd started carrying, a habit she'd picked up without entirely deciding to. The same way she'd picked up ballistics tables out of a used bookstore 5 years earlier. The first time I was shooting at the clock. The second time I was shooting at the target. She graduated 11 weeks later, one of 4 candidates out of the 17 who'd started, and the only woman in the class, a fact that the Corps' Public Affairs Office would have liked to make considerably more of than she ever allowed them to. She did not want a story about a woman breaking a barrier. She wanted, if she wanted anything at all beyond the simple fact of the work, a story about a mind that had finally been permitted to do the thing it had always been built to do. Prescott did not come to the graduation. He sent instead a small package that arrived 4 days later, containing nothing but a worn leather notebook, considerably older and more used than her own, its first pages filled with a decade of his own handwriting. Ballistics tables, wind corrections, small hand-drawn diagrams of exactly the kind he'd once sketched on paper plates outside a supply tent in Amber Hollow. And a short note clipped to the inside cover. "You already knew most of what's in here before you needed it. That's not luck. That's a mind that pays attention. Don't waste it, and don't let anyone tell you it was given to you. Nothing in this notebook was given. Every page of it was earned by somebody on some cold morning doing the work nobody made them do. Now it's yours." She called him 2 months later, on a night when the specific silence that used to terrify her had finally settled into something closer to peace, and they talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. Wind calls, range conditions, the specific misery of week 3. And near the end of the call, she found herself saying the things she had not planned to say. "I think about the valley almost every day," she told him. "Not the way I used to. Not like it's chasing me. More like it's just part of how I see distance now. Every open space I look at, some part of my mind is already running the numbers before I've decided to look at it that way." "That's not a wound," Prescott said. "That's what it looks like when something becomes permanent. It stopped being a memory and started being a way of seeing. That's the furthest most people ever get with anything they've learned. Most people learn a skill. You learned a way of paying attention to the world, and the skill just came along with it." She thought about her father, bent over trajectory charts in a small office that smelled like coffee and machine oil, teaching her without ever once meaning. To teach her that some minds simply needed to know why the numbers worked, not just that they did. She thought about a legal pad outside a supply tent and a paper plate with a crude diagram of an uphill shooting angle scratched into it, and a fly that had landed on the back of her hand at second 104 and stayed there because she would not move. She was 28 years old. She was a qualified precision marksman with a confirmed record and a reputation that had begun to travel quietly through the specific network of people who track competence wherever it surfaces, whether or not it announces itself. She had walked into that valley as a woman whose job was to count things, and she had walked out of it as something the Corps didn't entirely have a clean word for yet, though everyone who had been on that ridgeline with her had already settled privately on the only word that mattered. That night, alone in the small room she'd been assigned at her new post, she opened the notebook to the last page she'd written in. The entry from week 3, the one about the clock and the target, and beneath it, she wrote the date, and then 3 more words, in handwriting that had gotten steadier over the 11 weeks it took her to earn the right to write them. Graduated. Tab received. Ready. She closed the notebook, picked up her rifle, and went to see what the world needed her to be ready for next.